Let's briefly talk about ways of presenting sensor performance. Often when they look into air quality monitoring, policymakers, city administrations, citizens and other organizations have to sift through highly scientific information, which they often find difficult to comprehend. Grasping the essence of various analyses, let alone creating your own overall picture and ranking potential devices for your use case, may seem like a daunting task. Hence, a more straightforward representation of sensor performance would be useful. Now, there are many scientific parameters and analyses making up individual sensor performance. At a minimum, you should consider how well a sensor compares to a reference instrument, how much sensors of a certain type differ from one another, and whether this behavior changes over time, for instance due to drifting or relative humidity or other influences. From a user perspective, you might also be interested in how much effort you'll have to put into calibrating the sensors, whether they have a high data availability or they have often have breakdowns, and how your experimental design might actually affect usability of certain sensors. With our consortium, with the VAQUUMS project, we initially started working on this from the idea of summarizing all this knowledge into a single sensor quality index. This was an analogy with an air quality index, which summarizes concentration levels for various pollutants into discrete index levels, and then links each index level to behavioral options, like it is safe to go outside, or people suffering from COPD are better to refrain from physical exercise. In analogy, a sensor quality index would link a discrete sensor quality level to potential use cases instead of behavioral options for the air quality index. We brought together many European experts to work on this subject during a workshop. Our initial aim was understanding the various aspects involved and identifying roadblocks for the development of such a sensor quality index. The main question we asked ourselves was, what are key determinants for the applicability of a sensor for a certain use case? We discussed use cases like urban hotspot detection, exposure in schools, the evaluation of clean or healthy routes, and many other use cases. Our conclusion was rather simple. It is not possible to determine with absolute certainty whether a sensor can be used for a certain use case, as it will always also depend on your experimental design and certain specific circumstances like the extent of the effect you want to measure, the amount of other sources contributing to a certain pollutant, and even specific meteorological conditions during the time of experimentation. In the end, we even thought of the purpose of measurements, which is also a determining factor, and for instance a black box system with an algorithm that updates from time to time but does not indicate this to the user might not be such a good basis for policy triggers or new measures to be implemented based on the sensor reading. We just left the idea of the sensor quality index itself, as it lost its major advantage, the direct link to use cases. Instead, we focused on a visually easy to interpret representation of our test results. Many of the available visualizations, such as Ineris's butterfly diagram, have their merits. There are many others available as well. We chose to build our visualization on three principles. A first principle was that we needed a limited set of key parameters that would nonetheless bring across the entire story for a given sensor. A second principle is an easy interpretation through discrete index levels for each parameter. And the third principle we adhered to was a color coding providing a loose link to existing quality frameworks and frameworks in the making, such as the European normalization working groups, ad hoc projects like the density project we had in Flanders. In the end, we settled on a series of bar charts illustrating a number of general parameters: the out-of-the-box comparability to reference instruments, the impact of calibration on that comparability, which could also be indicative of the effort you have to put into calibrating the sensors or the risk you have of losing calibration over time. We also included between sensor uncertainty. How much do they differ from one another? Can you use a single sensor to calibrate the whole sensor network? Data availability is the final general parameter that we include. It illustrates the amount of hours in our experiment that were marked as valid in our quality control procedure. We also include a very limited number of sensor-specific parameters. For particulate matter sensors, for instance, we include a humidity factor. This factor illustrates a sensor's sensitivity to relative humidity and is an indication of how much you might struggle with dealing with episodes with very low or very high humidity. So in conclusion, we now have a single visualization that allows you to compare the available sensors. It brings across a large part of our story on the benefits and drawbacks of each sensor, and it allows you at a glance to identify the sensors of interest for your use case or experiment. If you want to know more about the results behind this visualization, have a look at our videos on lab and field tests. If you want to use this and implement sensors locally, have a look at our videos on the roadmap for cities and citizens, as well as our guidelines for using air quality sensors. It's in those guidelines that we try to valorize the specific insights coming from the expert workshop on the Sensor Quality Index. Thanks for watching.